What's up, guys? Josh Pate here. The Late Kick Grand Season Preview Series rolls on. We're talking Auburn today, and we're talking about a 2020 season that kind of low-key has been spoken about with varying degrees of pessimism on the plains for about the past 2 years. Not that anyone has waved a white flag. No, by no stretch is that happening. But people have looked at 2020. They've seen it coming since 2018. They've known we're going to have to replace a lot on the offensive line. This guy, Derek Brown's going to be gone. This guy, Marlon Davidson's going to be gone. Probably going to lose a lot in the secondary. Oh, and it's an even number year, which means we got to go to Georgia and to Alabama. And so the mood for 2020 has always been sort of extremely cautious optimism, knowing all the while that Auburn will recruit good enough to have good enough players on campus, but it's going to be one of those wait and see, tiptoe week by week sort of deals. Well, now we're in 2020. And so now we got a little bit better sense of what the Auburn 2020 football team will be. That's what this video is for, though. So let's dive right in. And what we're trying to do with this season preview is we're doing areas of focus. We're doing biggest questions. We're going to do record projections, best, worst, and most likely. And then I'm going to give you my final take on what I think a record will be for Auburn this year. So the first thing, when you look at their schedule and then you sync all that up with what I just said and what we know could be questions that we're going to ask in a second, first area of focus is, can they manage a fast start? Because here's the thing about Auburn. They don't start off, no one starts off with a bunch of cupcakes. You're playing 10 conference games in the SEC, but it hasn't been Gus Malzahn's career MO to start off fast. Normally, even the best Auburn teams have been Auburn teams that they do enough early on, and then they sort of build to hopefully a crescendo that comes later in the year when the big rivalry games are on tap. Well, this year, if you want to fulfill expectations, here's a little bit of the issue. You play an ultra-physical Kentucky team that'll have a chip the size of the state of Alabama on their shoulders in week one, and then you go to Georgia in week two. And while Auburn will be favored in the first of those, they will not be favored in the second. Suffice to say, those are both losable games. And that's why you got to manage at least somewhat of a hot start. I don't care how they do it. They could win 10-6 or they could win 39-38, but they got to find a way on some side of the ball or special teams to start hot there. And they're going to be doing it, obviously, with a lot of new pieces, specifically at coordinator, offensively, as well as offensive line coach, but also dealing with the uncertainty that COVID itself has presented Auburn. And they've had a lot of hiccups even during fall camp. So the fast start is imperative there. Also an area of focus for me, you could argue, and I don't think I'd argue back, that this is the toughest transition that Kevin Steele has had to make so far defensively in his time at Auburn. This has, keep in mind, become the trademark of Auburn football. Even as Gus Malzahn and his identity as an offensive guy, offensive guru, call him whatever you want to, is the head coach there. When they've been winning, it's been on the back of a Kevin Steele-led defense. Well, now Kevin Steele's still there, but a lot of the pieces that they've been able to ride for the last number of years now are gone. They're replacing, obviously, the aforementioned Derek Brown, Marlon Davidson up front on the defensive line. They're replacing, I think, 3 or 4 in the secondary. And so they're not without talent. That's what I want to stress here. This is not going to be an issue where you turn on Auburn's game against Kentucky or Georgia early in the year and you go, they just really don't have talent on the defensive line. There's no real depth there. They don't have good enough talent in the secondary. That's not it. But there's a big difference here in what we're talking about with the talent issue versus the ability to develop the talent. And it's going to be probably the most important spotlight shown, let's say, on the player development aspect of Auburn's defense and the ability to coach. They're going to have to do as good a coaching job as they have been in a while to get that talent ready to shine and ready to shine early, because they open, like I said, with not only 2 losable games, but I want you to think about this. When you're talking about replacing a bunch of pieces defensively, they open with 2 of the most physical teams in the SEC too. I mean, Kentucky hallmarks that offensive line as the foundation of their program and physical nature of their offense as the hallmark of their program. Well, okay. And then you go to Georgia in week 2 and it doesn't get any easier. So you better have the horses up front, because if someone in this league figures out they can run on you, they don't even bother throwing the ball. They'll just run it. You better believe Kentucky and Georgia will be more than happy to do that. And the third area of focus for me is the progression of Bo Nix. Typically, when you have a quarterback who starts as a freshman, you're going to take your lumps. So hopefully, if you're the caliber of Bo Nix, you see some good mixed in with the bad. And that was absolutely the case with Bo Nix last year. And then secondly, you would hope that you see adequate progression, year 2 and then year 3. And that's what it stands to reason conventional wisdom would suggest. Now, with Auburn, you're trying to buck a trend there. It's been very notable, and a lot of people have talked about it. The best success Malzahn has had with quarterbacks has not come with guys that he has himself recruited from high school and then developed them inside the Auburn program. It's normally come via a transfer, getting a guy in from JUCO or transfer from some other university, Nick Marshall being a transfer from inside the SEC. But the point is, they're trying to buck a trend there. And if they're ever going to do it, it's going to be Bo Nix. Bo Nix is insanely talented. Don't let the mistakes he made last year fool you. Don't let their offense's tendency to sometimes stall last year fool you. They got the right quarterback. Now, the questions become, as we're about to talk about, is he surrounded by the right supporting cast? Does he have a good enough offensive line in front of him? Is Chad Morris being added as offensive coordinator? Could that be the perfect marriage at the perfect time? All those are questions that will, in large part, go into answering, well, how much does he progress? The he being Bo Nix, year 1 to year 2. So those are some of the areas of focus. Now, how about the biggest questions for Auburn in 2020? As I flip the script, quite literally, with my notebook pad here. Quality depth is something you hear a lot this time of year in SEC camps and beyond. Quality depth. Anytime you're replacing starters, a lot of people want to know about quality depth. So I'm asking about quality depth at Auburn. Pass rusher and cornerback. 2 areas that I am razor sharp focused on when we finally get to see the first product of this team in 2020 against Kentucky. And I want to stress, I know that you've probably listened to practice reports and you've listened to press conferences, and this is not even unique to Auburn. A lot of programs and fan bases have done this, and you'll hear coaches throw out names. And sometimes those names end up living up to the billing, but names are not quality depth. Names are just that, names. Gus Malzahn could give the name of me and you and 2 of our buddies when he's talking about corner. Well, that's great. You just listed a bunch of names. None of us can win in the SEC. Does Auburn have guys who can win in the SEC? Because behind Roger McCreary, I know we got a lot of names there. And I know we're looking at names and we're probably hearing names every day. Pritchett, Simpson, Hill, the transfer, DeMio, who I think has been banged up a little bit, but figures to contribute at some point this year. Coaches all say they're confident here. How much of practice have you seen? I hadn't seen any. Have you seen any? And so the point is, we got to take them at their word. Let's hope they don't mislead us. But just like at pass rusher, you know the names. If you're an Auburn fan, you know the names, just like we're hearing the names at defensive back. We'll find out if it's quality depth versus if it's just a bunch of names being thrown out there and guys who are pretty good and pretty scrappy, but ultimately when you go up against the best receivers or maybe the best quarterbacks in the SEC, and then you find out probably just a lot of average to slightly above average by SEC standards, players competing against each other. So Auburn's had a tendency to have these guys come out of nowhere. What I'm telling you is I don't know. That's why it's a question for me. Number 2, offensive line is, really obviously the biggest question here. I almost skipped over it because it's been spoken about ad nauseum, but I want to know what the ceiling is for the offensive line. I don't even want to ask the question. It's just, we know it's a question mark. We know they're replacing 5 seniors there. And think about all the questions here, how big, I guess, that question mark is. It's in like 72-point font. Just say it out loud with me. It could be Auburn. It could be anybody. You replace 5 seniors. I think you got 1 guy on the roster returning that's ever started for Auburn. You also lose spring due to COVID. You bring in a new offensive line coach. And in the fall camp sessions, you have had to pause things. So you've had a lot of disruptions with COVID. You got all that. And this is not a team expected to go 3-7. You have expectation. So you can't afford a rebuilding year. You understand now, even if you don't know anything about Auburn, about why offensive line is a question at Auburn. Very little experience, obviously. That doesn't always spell doom, though. Just like a ton of returning starters doesn't always spell automatic success. But I'll tell you what this does. My expectation here is I hope we can get an average to slightly above average product. I'm not going to shoot for the moon, okay? If that gets delivered, that's great. Last year, this time, we were questioning LSU's offensive line, and that unit won the Joe Moore Award. So if that happens at Auburn, that would be wonderful. What I'd love to see is an average to above average product and then an offensive philosophy that is built to not necessarily expose that week to week. And I'll tell you what that does. It makes Bo Nix important for obvious reasons, but it also makes the ability of those backs out of the backfield to catch the ball and to be legitimate receiving threats. It makes that important. It makes it important to maybe utilize some H-back, tight end-ish type talent utilize it more, maybe more so than it has been utilized in the past. All this is very important because that's kind of what LSU, I'm not comparing the two, certainly not, but that's what LSU was able to do last year. They understood, I mean, offensive line, it may be a weakness early. We can work around that. So can Auburn work around that? Can Chad Morris put in an offensive system there and a philosophy early on that works around that? Broderius Ham, by the way, really good story there. Probably going to start at left tackle for him. And Brandon Council is the transfer from Akron. Those two are key. Nick Brahms, you got to assume you can count on. He's been there quite a while now. But those two are keys. Those two will be the keys in deciding whether Auburn's offensive line's a liability all year versus whether you get pretty good and definitely serviceable offensive line play. And as the offensive line goes, as is usually the case in this sport, the rest of the offense will go. And then behind that offensive line, I really wonder if this running game can end up being the engine for not only the offense, but this entire team. Because when I'm looking at Auburn, with all the questions that we've asked, one area I think you can lean on with this team, and one that I think you can count on to show up every Saturday, is the stable of backs they have. I don't necessarily know that they got a guy who's going to be a 1,500-yard feature back in the SEC, the likes of which you've seen there in classical Auburn years. But Shaun Shivers is a guy they really like. DJ Williams is a guy they loved coming in last year, and I loved coming in last year and still do, for the record. Mark Anthony Richards, is a guy who probably possesses the skill set that best fits the style that I think they're going to have to play early. And Tank Bigsby is a guy I watched a lot play down at Callaway High School in Georgia. He comes in too. So Jatarvius Whitlow was a name we were talking about last year. Whitlow's out of here. So these four are the ones they got to depend on. And I think they can. To what degree? Is it a situation where we're watching them win and we're saying, boy, that running game carried them again? Or is it a situation where you're saying, not quite getting what we need out of the run game? And as a result, we're having to ask Bo Nix to bail us out, and we don't necessarily have the personnel to fit that approach. That's why, again, this is a question. So let's talk schedule analysis here. I don't do, as I've said before, the thing where you line all the games you're going to play up. And I say, all right, I think you're going to win this one, lose, win. And then I predict you're going to go 7-3. I don't think there's any skill in that. And to be honest, there's not much skill in this period. But what I do like to do is take every game you're going to play and I give a 1 to 10 toughness rating. Part of that toughness rating is just the quality of the opponent. The other part of that is what situation are you in? Is it a back-to-back road spot? Is your opponent coming off a bye, or is you coming off a rivalry game? All that matters. So let's take a look at Auburn's schedule. Kentucky is the opener. Graded that one a 7. That's pretty easy. Kentucky is a top 20-ish caliber opponent at home. Good, stiff open to the season there for Auburn. Gave that one a 7. The Georgia game, obviously a 10. And then you look down the schedule a little bit. That visit from LSU qualifies as a 9. Always a close game, always a very physical game. And then you end the season at Alabama. That is an obvious 10-rated game. And Texas A&M, this is a hard one to grade, okay? I can only go on what the teams are right now, knowing obviously the teams will be radically different by this point, but we don't know for the better or for the worse. Auburn having to play a regular season game coming off the Iron Bowl, that's a big deal. And if it's a high-quality opponent, then that one gets a 9 automatically in my book. Whereas if you opened against A&M, it would probably only be graded an 8. So I take these games and these grades and I simulate the season in our model 1,000 times. And here's what our models spit out. We do a best case, worst case, and most likely. For Auburn, the best case we have for the Tigers is 9-1. There is obviously a path here. If this offense shakes out the way that you want it to and defensive questions become defensive answers early on, and that run game is the engine coupled with a progressive passing attack that you see evolve week to week, 9-1 could happen there. That would, I think, have to involve going 2-0 to start the year. I think that would probably have to happen. The worst case is 4-6, because the worst case is it ends up that really there aren't many facets of this team that you can lean on. And then you also probably, if you go 4-6, you couple in the possibility that you've had critical injuries. COVID has disrupted your season. So 4-6 is the worst it could go. There is a wide variance here. Auburn is the widest, best, and worst case variance team I have in Power 5 this year. That's why I said they're the biggest mystery team. The most likely record for Auburn I have as 7-3. And let me tell you what our model did. Our model spit out 6.5 wins and 3.5 losses on average for the most likely. I rounded up to 7-3. And what led me to round it up, and it was kind of a judgment call there, is of these games that they have rated 8 or higher, they play 4 of them. and it's at Georgia, LSU, at Alabama, and Texas A&M. 3 of those 4 are in the back half of their schedule. So what my hope there is, in picking them to go 7-3, is that by the time they get to the true meat of their schedule at the back half, that whatever the final version of this team will be, it has coalesced, and hopefully the final version is one that's going to be very competitive in those games. So 7-3, the most likely scenario that the model spits out, 7-3 is what I'm going to roll with the Auburn Tigers, with the ceiling being 9-1. And if they are 9-1, you got to believe that they are squarely in the mix for the SEC championship and the college football playoff. Let's just avoid the trapdoor that leads to 4-6.